They called him a killer. They called her a sacrifice. But when Lydia Hale stood at that altar beside Caleb Rourke, the most feared man in the Montana Territory, no one knew the truth. Her father hadn't just sold her to clear a debt. He'd sold her twice. And the second buyer was riding toward Red Hollow with a claim no law could break and no mercy in his heart. This is the story of a woman who married a monster to escape a devil, only to discover that the most dangerous thing in the mountains wasn't the man they feared. It was the choice she'd have to make when both men came to collect. If you're drawn to stories of courage, redemption, and love that defends rather than demands, stay with me until the end. And when you do, hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories travel. The chapel in Red Hollow had never felt smaller. Lydia Hale stood at the altar in a dress that had belonged to her mother, the lace yellowed with age, the hems still bearing the dust of the ranch where she'd grown up. Her hands were steady, but only because she'd learned long ago that showing fear invited cruelty. The Reverend's voice droned through the ceremony like a sentencing, each word a nail in the coffin of the life she'd known. Beside her stood Caleb Rourke. He didn't look at her. His eyes were fixed somewhere beyond the crowd, beyond the rough-hewn walls, beyond the territory itself. He wore black, not because it was fitting for a wedding, but because it was all he owned. His shoulders were broad enough to block the light from the windows. His hands, scarred and calloused, hung loose at his sides. He smelled of wood smoke and pine and something wilder, something that belonged to the high country where men went to disappear. The townspeople had packed the pews, but not to celebrate. They'd come to witness. Do you, Lydia May Hale, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband? The Reverend's question hung in the air like smoke. Lydia felt the weight of every eye in the room. Mrs. Pruitt in the second row, clutching her Bible like a shield. The blacksmith's son near the back, the same boy who'd asked her to dance at the harvest social last year, his face tight with something between pity and disgust. Her father, Thomas Hale, sitting in the front pew with his hat in his hands and his gaze fixed on the floorboards. He couldn't even look at her. I do, Lydia said. Her voice didn't waver. That, at least, was hers to control. And do you, Caleb James Rourke, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife? Caleb's voice was low, rough as creekstone. I do. Then by the power vested in me, I pronounce you man and wife. The Reverend closed his book with a snap that echoed like a gunshot. You may kiss the bride. Caleb turned to her then, and for the first time Lydia met his eyes. They were gray, storm cloud gray, the kind of gray that came before lightning. He didn't kiss her. Instead, he gave a single nod, acknowledgement, not affection, and turned toward the door. The crowd parted like water. Lydia followed him out into the September sunlight, her shoes clicking against the chapel steps, her heart hammering against her ribs. A wagon waited in the street, loaded with her few possessions, a trunk of clothes, her mother's quilt, a wooden box containing the few things she couldn't bear to leave behind. Caleb climbed onto the wagon bench without offering her a hand. Lydia climbed up beside him, arranging her skirts, keeping her spine straight. She'd been raised on a ranch. She knew how to sit a saddle, how to mend fence, how to deliver a calf in the small hours of the morning. She knew how to survive. She'd need every bit of that knowledge now. Caleb snapped the reins and the horses pulled forward. The wagon wheels groaned. Behind them, the town of Red Hollow grew smaller, the faces in the street blurring into a collective judgment Lydia would carry like a brand. They thought she was being led to slaughter. Maybe they were right. The silence between them stretched for miles. The road climbed steadily, winding through foothills thick with ponderosa pine and Douglas fir. The air grew thinner, sharper, carrying the scent of resin and distant snow. Lydia watched the landscape change, the familiar rolling grasslands giving way to something older, darker, more unforgiving. Caleb didn't speak. He kept his eyes on the trail, his hands steady on the reins, his jaw set beneath the shadow of his hat brim. He'd shaved for the wedding, the only concession he'd made to civilization, but stubble was already darkening his face. There were scars there, thin white lines that interrupted the planes of his cheekbones, a thicker one that cut through his left eyebrow. Lydia wondered what had put them there. She wondered if she'd bear her own scars before this marriage was through. How far? she asked, breaking the silence. Caleb's eyes flicked toward her, then back to the road. Another 3 hours, maybe 4. His voice startled her, not because it was harsh, but because it wasn't. It was quiet, measured, almost careful. The cabin's in the high country, he continued, past the timberline. Not easy country, but it's safe. Safe. The word felt strange coming from him. Safe from what? Lydia asked. Caleb's hands tightened on the reins. For a long moment, he didn't answer. Then, from men who'd use you for leverage. Lydia's stomach turned cold. You mean my father's debts? Among other things. What other things? Caleb glanced at her again, and this time his gaze lingered. There was something in his expression, not pity, not cruelty, but a kind of grim recognition, as if he were seeing her clearly for the first time. You don't know, he said quietly. Know what? What your father promised, or to who? Lydia's hands clenched in her lap. He promised me to you to clear the debt. That's part of it, Caleb said, but there's more. And you deserve to know before we get to the cabin. He pulled the wagon off the road into a clearing where a creek ran shallow and fast over smooth stones. The horses dipped their heads to drink. Caleb set the brake and climbed down, his movements deliberate, controlled. Lydia stayed on the bench, her heart pounding. Caleb stood by the creek, his back to her, his shoulders tense beneath his coat. When he finally spoke, his voice carried across the water like a confession. Your father came to me 2 months ago, he said. Said he owed money to a man named Grant Mercer. Said Mercer was going to take the ranch, take everything, unless the debt was cleared. He offered me land, livestock, whatever he had left. Lydia felt the words like a physical blow. She'd known her father was desperate. She'd known the ranch was failing, but she hadn't known how far he'd fallen. I didn't take his offer, Caleb continued. Told him to sell what he could, pay what he owed, and walk away with his dignity. But then he said something that changed everything. Caleb turned to face her, and the look in his eyes made Lydia's blood run cold. He said Mercer didn't just want the ranch. He wanted you. The world tilted. Lydia gripped the edge of the wagon bench, her knuckles white. That's not... My father wouldn't... He already had, Caleb said flatly. Mercer holds a contract. Your father signed it 6 months ago, before he even came to me. A promissory note that put you up as collateral. If the debt wasn't paid by the end of September, you became Mercer's property, not his wife, his property. Lydia couldn't breathe. She thought of Grant Mercer, the land baron who owned half the valley, the man who'd built his fortune on foreclosures and broken families. She'd seen him once, at the territorial fair. He'd looked at her the way men looked at cattle. Why didn't my father tell me? She whispered. Because he's a coward, Caleb said, and because he thought he could fix it. When he couldn't, he came to me with a different offer. Lydia's throat tightened. What offer? Marry you first. Make the contract invalid. The pieces fell into place like stones into a grave. You married me to protect me, Lydia said slowly. Not because you wanted me, because Mercer wanted me. Yes. The simplicity of the answer cut deeper than cruelty would have. Lydia climbed down from the wagon, her legs unsteady. She walked to the edge of the creek, staring down at her reflection in the water. A woman in a borrowed dress, a bride without a celebration, a daughter sold twice over. Does Mercer know? She asked. By now he does, Caleb said, which is why we're not staying in Red Hollow. The cabin's remote, difficult to reach. If Mercer comes looking, he'll have to come through me. Lydia turned to face him. And you think that'll stop him? No, Caleb said. But it'll slow him down. And it gives you something your father never did. What's that? A choice. Lydia stared at him. I didn't choose this. Not yet, Caleb agreed. But you will. When the time comes, you'll decide what happens next. Not your father, not Mercer, not me, you. The words settled into Lydia's chest like an anchor. For the first time since the wedding, she felt something other than fear. She felt fury. They reached the cabin as the sun dipped below the western peaks. The structure sat in a natural bowl, sheltered by towering spruce and granite outcroppings that rose like cathedral walls. Smoke curled from the stone chimney. A lean-to stable stood to one side, already stocked with hay. Beyond the cabin, a creek tumbled down from the high country, its voice a constant murmur against the silence. It was beautiful. It was a fortress. Caleb brought the wagon to a stop and climbed down, moving to unhitch the horses with practiced efficiency. Lydia stepped onto ground that felt too solid, too real, too far from everything she'd known. "There's firewood stacked inside," Caleb said, not looking at her. "Pantry's stocked. Creek's clean for drinking. You'll have everything you need." Lydia watched him work. "Where will you sleep?" Caleb paused, his hands on the harness straps. "There's a loft. I'll take that. You'll have the main room and the bed." "That's not—" "It's how it's going to be," Caleb interrupted, his voice firm but not harsh. "I didn't marry you to claim you, Lydia. I married you to keep you alive. That means you get privacy, respect, and space. I won't touch you unless you ask me to." Lydia's cheeks burned. "I'm not going to ask you to." "Then we understand each other." He finished unhitching the horses and led them to the stable. Lydia stood in the growing dusk, listening to the creek, the wind in the pines, the distant call of a hawk circling the peaks. She'd expected violence. She'd expected demands. She hadn't expected this. When Caleb returned, he carried her trunk on one shoulder as if it weighed nothing. He set it inside the cabin, then stepped back to give her space. "I'll bring in the rest," he said. "You should settle in. It'll be full dark soon." Lydia stepped inside. The cabin was simple but well made. A stone fireplace dominated one wall. A cast-iron stove sat ready for cooking. A table, 2 chairs, a bed frame with a rope mattress, and blankets that smelled of cedar. Shelves lined the walls, stocked with dry goods, preserves, tools. A rifle hung over the door. It wasn't a prison. It was a refuge. Lydia sat on the edge of the bed, her hands in her lap, her mind racing. Outside, she heard Caleb moving, unloading the wagon, tending the horses, preparing for the night. He moved with the efficiency of a man who'd lived alone for a long time, who needed no one, who asked for nothing, who'd still chosen to protect her. When full dark came, Caleb built a fire in the hearth. The flames cast long shadows across the rough-planked floor. He filled a pot with water from the creek, set it on the stove, and produced 2 tin cups. "Coffee," he said, handing her one. "It's not much, but it's hot." Lydia wrapped her hands around the cup, grateful for the warmth. "Thank you." Caleb nodded and took his own cup to the far side of the room, putting distance between them. He sat with his back to the wall, his long legs stretched out, his eyes on the fire. The silence returned, but this time it felt different, less like a threat, more like a truce. "Can I ask you something?" Lydia said. Caleb glanced at her. "Go ahead." "Why did you agree to this? You don't know me. You don't know my father anything. Why would you risk everything to protect someone you've never met?" Caleb was quiet for a long time. When he spoke, his voice was low, almost too quiet to hear. "Because I know what it's like to be used," he said, "to be traded for someone else's mistake. And I swore a long time ago that if I ever had the chance to stop it happening to someone else, I would." Lydia studied his face in the firelight, the scars, the hard lines, the weariness that went deeper than exhaustion. "What happened to you?" she asked softly. Caleb's jaw tightened. "Nothing that matters now. It matters to me." He looked at her then, really looked at her, and Lydia saw something flicker in those storm-gray eyes. Surprise, maybe, or recognition. "You should get some rest," Caleb said, standing. "Tomorrow's going to be a long day. I'll need to scout the trails, make sure no one's following." "You think Mercer will come?" "I think he's already planning to," Caleb said. "But we'll be ready." He climbed the ladder to the loft, and Lydia heard the creak of wood as he settled in above her. She lay down on the bed, fully clothed, staring up at the ceiling. Outside, the wind sang through the pines. Inside, the fire crackled and popped. And for the first time in months, Lydia Hale felt something she hadn't expected to feel again. She felt safe. The days that followed fell into a rhythm. Caleb rose before dawn, tended the horses, checked the perimeter, and disappeared into the forest for hours at a time. He always returned before dark, carrying game or firewood, or news that the trails were clear. He spoke little, but when he did speak, it was with a careful honesty that Lydia came to trust. She took over the cabin's interior, cooking, cleaning, organizing supplies. She found a garden plot behind the cabin, overgrown but salvageable, and set to work clearing it. The physical labor felt good. It gave her purpose. It kept her mind from spiraling into the future. In the evenings, they shared simple meals at the table. Caleb always asked about her day, listened to her answers, and offered practical advice when she needed it. He never pried, never pushed, never crossed the invisible line he'd drawn between them. But Lydia found herself watching him. The way he moved, controlled, deliberate, never wasted motion. The way he cared for the horses, speaking to them in a low voice that gentled the wildness in their eyes. The way he sat by the fire at night, whittling small pieces of wood into shapes she couldn't yet identify. He wasn't what the town had called him. He was something else entirely. One evening, nearly a week after they'd arrived, Lydia worked up the courage to ask the question that had been building in her chest. "Why do they call you a killer?" Caleb's knife stilled against the wood. He didn't look up. "Because I've killed men." The bluntness of it should have frightened her. It didn't. "In the war?" Lydia asked. "After," Caleb said. "I was a scout for the cavalry, did work in the territories when the fighting with the tribes was still hot, killed men who needed killing, killed some who probably didn't. When it was over, I came back and found out I didn't fit anywhere anymore." He set the knife down, his hand still. "The town was afraid of me," he continued. "Treated me like I was still at war, so I left. Came up here. Built this place. Thought I could put it all behind me." "But you couldn't," Lydia said quietly. "No," Caleb agreed. "I couldn't. Is that why you helped me? Because you know what it's like to be judged for things you can't change?" Caleb looked at her then, and the honesty in his gaze took her breath away. "I helped you because it was the right thing to do," he said. "And because I couldn't live with myself if I let Mercer take you." Lydia felt something shift in her chest, a softening, a recognition, a bridge forming across the distance between them. "Thank you," she said. Caleb nodded and picked up his knife again. "Don't thank me yet. Mercer's still out there, and when he comes, things are going to get ugly." "When he comes," Lydia said, "I won't hide." Caleb's eyes met hers. "I know." And in that moment, Lydia understood something fundamental. She wasn't his prisoner, she was his ally. The morning of the 10th day dawned cold and bright. Caleb was already outside when Lydia woke, his voice carrying through the open door as he spoke to the horses. She dressed quickly, braided her hair, and stepped into the crisp mountain air. Caleb stood by the corral, his hand on the neck of the roan mare. When he saw Lydia, his expression shifted. Not quite a smile, but something close. "Morning," he said. "Morning," Lydia replied. "Anything unusual on the trails?" "Not yet," Caleb said, "but that could change. I'm going to ride higher today, check the passes. If Mercer's planning to come through, he'll use one of 3 routes. I need to know which one." Lydia felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. "How long will you be gone?" "Most of the day. I'll be back before nightfall." Caleb paused, his gaze steady. "You'll be safe here. The rifle's loaded. Anyone comes up this trail, you fire a warning shot and get inside. Bar the door. Don't open it for anyone but me." "Oh," Lydia nodded. "I can handle myself." "I know," Caleb said, and there was something in his voice, respect, maybe, or trust, that made Lydia stand a little taller. He swung onto the roan with the ease of a man who'd lived half his life in the saddle. "I'll see you tonight." "Be careful," Lydia said. Caleb's eyes lingered on her for a moment longer than necessary. Then he nodded and rode into the trees. Lydia watched until he disappeared, then turned back to the cabin. She had work to do. The morning passed in quiet industry. Lydia baked bread, mended a tear in one of Caleb's shirts, and hauled water from the creek. She was hanging laundry on the line when she heard it. The sound of hooves on the trail below. Multiple horses. Coming fast. Lydia's heart slammed against her ribs. She dropped the shirt she was holding and ran for the cabin. Her hands shook as she grabbed the rifle from above the door, checked the load, and moved to the window. 3 riders emerged from the trees. The man in the lead sat tall in the saddle, his coat tailored, his hat expensive. Even from a distance, Lydia recognized him. Grant Mercer. He pulled his horse to a stop 30 yards from the cabin, flanked by 2 hired guns whose hands rested too casually near their sidearms. "Mrs. Rourke," Mercer called, his voice smooth as oil. "I know you're in there. Come out. Let's talk like civilized people." Lydia's hands tightened on the rifle. "I have nothing to say to you," she called back, her voice steady despite the terror clawing at her throat. Mercer smiled. It was the kind of smile a wolf gave before it struck. "Now that's no way to greet an old friend," he said. "Your father and I had an arrangement, a legal arrangement, and I've come to collect what's owed to me." "My father had no right to make that arrangement," Lydia shot back, "and I'm married now. Whatever contract you think you have, it's void." Mercer's smile didn't falter. "A marriage conducted under duress isn't legally binding, Mrs. Rourke, and I'm afraid your husband didn't do his homework. I have documents signed and witnessed that put you in my care until your father's debt is settled. Now you can come with me peacefully, or my men can come in and get you. Your choice." Lydia raised the rifle to her shoulder, sighting down the barrel. "You take 1 step toward this cabin," she said, her voice ringing clear across the distance, "and I'll put a bullet through your chest." Mercer's eyes narrowed. "You don't want to do that, sweetheart." "Don't call me that," Lydia said, "and don't test me." For a long moment, nobody moved. Then Mercer nodded to the man on his left. The gunman dismounted and started walking toward the cabin. Lydia fired. The bullet kicked up dirt 2 feet in front of the man's boots. He froze, his hand flying to his sidearm. "Next one won't miss," Lydia said. The gunman looked back at Mercer, who'd gone very still in his saddle. "You've got fire," Mercer said quietly. "I'll give you that. But you're alone, Mrs. Rourke, and we both know Rourke isn't here to protect you. So here's what's going to happen. You're going to put down that rifle, walk out here, and come with me. And in return, I won't burn that cabin to the ground with you inside it." Lydia's heart hammered. Her hands were slick with sweat on the rifle stock. She was alone. She was outgunned, and Mercer knew it. But before she could respond, a voice cut through the clearing like a blade. "She's not alone." Caleb Rourke stepped out of the trees behind Mercer's men, a rifle trained on the land baron's back. His face was expressionless. His finger rested on the trigger. "You've got 3 seconds to turn those horses around and ride out of here," Caleb said quietly, "or I'll kill all 3 of you where you sit." Mercer didn't turn, but Lydia saw his shoulders stiffen. "Rourke," he said, "I should have known." "You should have," Caleb agreed. "Now move." Mercer's hand drifted toward his coat. "Don't," Caleb said, and there was something in his voice, something cold and final, that made even the hired guns go pale. Mercer's hand stopped. "This isn't over," he said. "It is if you're smart," Caleb replied, "but we both know you're not. So when you come back, and you will come back, make sure you bring the sheriff, because the next time you ride onto my land without a warrant, I won't give you a warning." For a long, tense moment, the clearing held its breath. Then Mercer nodded to his men. The 3 of them turned their horses and rode back down the trail, disappearing into the trees. Caleb didn't lower his rifle until the sound of hooves had faded completely. Then he turned to the cabin, and Lydia saw the fury in his eyes, not at her, but at the situation, at the men who'd come, at the battle that was only beginning. "Are you hurt?" he asked. "No," Lydia said. Her voice sounded distant, unreal. Caleb walked to the cabin and took the rifle from her trembling hands. He set it aside and placed his palms on her shoulders, steady and warm. "You did good," he said. "You stood your ground. That took courage." Lydia looked up at him, and the fear she'd been holding back finally broke through. "He's going to come back," she whispered. "I know," Caleb said. "But next time we'll be ready, and next time I won't let him get this close." Lydia felt the tears she'd been fighting spill down her cheeks. She'd been strong for so long, strong through her father's betrayal, strong through the wedding, strong through the journey to this mountain refuge. But standing there with Caleb's hands on her shoulders and the weight of what had almost happened crushing down on her, she broke. Caleb pulled her against his chest without a word. His arms came around her solid and protective, and Lydia buried her face in his coat and wept. He didn't tell her it would be okay. He didn't make promises he couldn't keep. He just held her while the storm passed. And when she finally pulled back, wiping her eyes, Caleb's expression was grim. "We need to talk," he said, "because Mercer's not going to give up. And if we're going to survive what's coming, you need to know everything." Lydia nodded. "Tell me." Caleb led her inside, closed the door, and began to speak. And as the sun set over the Montana peaks, Lydia learned the full truth of the man she'd married, and the price he was willing to pay to keep her free. The firelight painted shifting shadows across Caleb's face as he settled into the chair across from Lydia. He'd poured them both coffee, though neither had touched it. The cups sat cooling on the table between them, steam rising like ghosts in the lamplight. Lydia waited. She'd learned in the past 10 days that Caleb didn't waste words, that when he spoke it was because he'd chosen his truths carefully. She could see him doing that now, sorting through the weight of what he needed to tell her, deciding where to begin. "Grant Mercer and I have history," Caleb finally said. "Goes back 7 years to right after I left the cavalry. I was working as a tracker for the territorial marshal, hunting down a gang that had been hitting settlements along the Missouri. Mercer was just starting out then, buying up land cheap from families who couldn't make it through the winters. He was smart about it. Always had the paperwork in order. Always stayed just on the right side of legal." Caleb's hands wrapped around his coffee cup. "But he didn't drink. I didn't pay much attention to him then. My job was tracking killers, not land speculators. But one of the men I was hunting, a man named Dalton Cross, he'd been doing work for Mercer, burning out homesteaders who wouldn't sell, running off livestock, poisoning wells. The kind of work Mercer could deny if it ever came back to him." Lydia felt her stomach tighten. "You caught him? This Dalton Cross?" "I caught him," Caleb confirmed, "but not before he told me who'd hired him. I brought that information to the marshal. The marshal brought it to the territorial governor, and the governor brought it to Mercer's lawyers." He looked up at Lydia, and his eyes were hard. 3 days later, the case was dismissed. Dalton Cross was released, and I was told that if I valued my position, I'd forget everything I'd heard. "They protected him," Lydia said quietly. "Mercer had money. Money buys protection, even from the law." Caleb's jaw tightened. "I couldn't let it go. I went to the families Cross had terrorized, helped them file civil complaints. Testified about what Cross had told me. Mercer's lawyers tore me apart in court, said I was a violent man with a grudge, that I'd coerced the confession, that I couldn't be trusted because of the things I'd done in the war." Lydia could hear the old anger in his voice, banked but still burning. "The judge ruled in Mercer's favor," Caleb continued, "and that same week, I was fired from the marshal's office. No explanation, no recourse. I was blacklisted from law work across the territory. That's when I came up here. Built this cabin. Tried to put distance between myself and men like Grant Mercer." He stood and moved to the window, looking out at the darkness beyond the glass. "Your father didn't know any of that when he came to me," Caleb said. "He just knew I was the only man in the territory who Mercer couldn't buy and couldn't intimidate. He thought that made me the perfect person to protect you. He was half right." Lydia rose and crossed to stand beside him. "What's the other half?" "The other half is that Mercer doesn't forgive debts or forget grudges. By marrying you, I didn't just block his claim. I declared war." Caleb turned to face her. "He won't come with lawyers next time, Lydia. He'll come with enough men and enough guns to make this look like a tragedy instead of a crime. And he'll make sure there are no witnesses left to say otherwise." The words should have terrified her. Instead, they ignited something fierce and hot in her chest. "Then we need to be ready," Lydia said. "You said next time we'd be prepared. What does that mean?" Caleb studied her face, and something shifted in his expression, respect mixing with concern. "It means we don't wait for him to choose the ground. It means we take this fight to a place where the law can't ignore what he's doing." "Red Hollow," Lydia said. "Red Hollow," Caleb agreed. "We need witnesses. We need the sheriff on record. We need to force Mercer's hand in front of people who can't be bought or scared into silence." Lydia's mind raced. "But if we go back to town, we're exposed. He could grab me in the street, claim I'm his property based on that contract. Not if we get there first. Not if we make sure everyone knows exactly what Mercer's trying to do. Caleb moved back to the table and pulled out a chair for her. Sit. I need to explain something about territorial law. Lydia sat. Caleb remained standing, his hands braced on the back of the opposite chair. Your father's contract with Mercer is legal in the narrow sense that it exists and it's signed, Caleb began. But it's not enforceable in the way Mercer's claiming. You can't sign away another person as collateral in Montana territory. The law is clear on that. What makes this complicated is that Mercer's lawyers have found a loophole. What loophole? They're claiming the contract isn't about you as collateral. They're claiming it's a marriage contract, that your father promised you in marriage to Mercer as settlement of the debt, and that Mercer has the right to collect on that promise. Lydia felt the blood drain from her face. That's medieval. That's technically legal under territorial statutes if both parties consented, Caleb said, which is where their case falls apart. You didn't consent. You had no knowledge of the arrangement, and you're already married to someone else. But to make that stick in court, we need proof that our marriage is legitimate and that you entered into it freely. How do we prove that? We go back to Red Hollow. We make a statement to the sheriff and the territorial magistrate. We get witnesses on record saying you chose this marriage, that you're living as my wife, that there's no coercion. Caleb's eyes met hers. And we make it clear that any attempt to take you by force will be met with force in return. Once that's on the record, Mercer can't move against you without risking everything he's built. Lydia absorbed this, her mind working through the implications. But that requires us to appear to be a real married couple, not just legally married, actually married. Yes, Caleb said quietly. The word hung in the air between them. Lydia looked down at her hands, at the simple gold band Caleb had placed there during the ceremony. She'd barely thought about it in the days since, too focused on survival to consider what it meant. But now, in the lamplight, it caught and held her attention. What exactly would that require? She asked. It would require us to present ourselves as husband and wife when we're in town, to show that we share a home, share a life, to demonstrate that this is a real marriage, not a legal fiction. Caleb paused. I won't ask you to pretend affection you don't feel, but I will ask you to stand beside me and let the town see that you chose this, that you chose me. Lydia met his eyes. And after? After Mercer's claim is defeated? After, you're free to stay or go as you choose. I meant what I said the day we married, Lydia. I'm not keeping you here against your will. This cabin, this life. It's yours if you want it. But if you don't, I'll help you get somewhere safe. Somewhere Mercer can't touch you. The honesty in his voice undid something in Lydia's chest. She thought of the past 10 days, of the careful distance Caleb had maintained, of the respect he'd shown even when he didn't have to, of the way he'd stepped out of the trees today with a rifle trained on armed men, willing to kill to protect her. He'd given her safety without demanding anything in return. That was rarer than gold in this territory. When do we leave? Lydia asked. Caleb's shoulders relaxed slightly. Day after tomorrow. I need to scout the trail again, make sure Mercer hasn't left men watching the passes. And you'll need to prepare. When we ride into Red Hollow, you need to look like a woman who's been well cared for, not a prisoner. Lydia almost smiled. I'll do my best. You'll do fine, Caleb said. And there was something in his voice, warmth maybe, or the beginning of trust, that made Lydia's heart quicken. They sat in silence for a while, drinking their coffee as it cooled, listening to the fire pop and settle. Outside, the wind had picked up, carrying the promise of weather from the high peaks. Lydia thought about what lay ahead, the ride back to Red Hollow, the confrontation with Mercer, the public claiming of a marriage she'd never asked for. She thought about the town's judgment, the whispers, the certainty everyone had that she'd been sold to a monster. Let them think what they wanted. She'd know the truth. Caleb, she said quietly. He looked up from his coffee. Thank you for telling me everything, for not keeping me in the dark. Caleb nodded. You deserve the truth. Always. Lydia stood, suddenly exhausted. The fear from earlier, the confrontation with Mercer, the weight of all she'd learned, it crashed over her like a wave. I should sleep. Tomorrow's going to be long. It is, Caleb agreed. He rose as well, moving toward the ladder to the loft, but he paused at the foot of it, his hand on the rung. Lydia? Yes? You were brave today, when Mercer came. You didn't freeze. You didn't run. That kind of courage is rare. Lydia felt heat rise in her cheeks. I was terrified. Courage isn't the absence of fear, Caleb said. It's acting despite it. Remember that when we ride into town. You're stronger than they know, stronger than Mercer knows. And that's going to make all the difference. He climbed the ladder before she could respond, disappearing into the loft above. Lydia stood alone in the main room, her hand pressed against her chest, where her heart still hammered. She believed him. For the first time since this nightmare began, she believed she might actually survive it. The next day dawned gray and cold, with clouds pressing low against the peaks. Caleb left before sunrise to scout the trails, and Lydia threw herself into preparation. She washed her hair in water heated on the stove, scrubbing away the dust and fear of the past weeks. She mended the yellow dress she'd worn to the wedding, though she couldn't quite bring herself to call it a wedding dress. She went through her trunk and found the blue wool dress her mother had made her 3 years ago. Still good, still presentable. She would wear that when they rode into Red Hollow. Blue had always been her mother's favorite color. It seemed fitting. Caleb returned in the early afternoon, his face grim. Mercer's got 2 men watching the main trail, he reported. They're not trying to hide. They're making sure we know they're there. Lydia's hand stilled on the dress she was folding. Can we get around them? There's an old mining road that cuts through the western ridge. It's rough, takes twice as long, but it'll bring us into Red Hollow from a different direction. They won't be expecting it. Caleb stripped off his coat and hung it by the door. We'll leave before dawn tomorrow. Travel light. If everything goes right, we'll be in town by midday. And if it doesn't go right, Caleb met her eyes. Then we make it go right. That night, they prepared in silence. Caleb checked and rechecked his rifle, his sidearm, the ammunition. Lydia packed a small bag with the essentials they'd need: food for the journey, a change of clothes, the marriage certificate Reverend Hayes had signed, evidence of their union. She caught Caleb watching her as she folded the certificate carefully and placed it in her bag. What? She asked. Nothing, Caleb said, but his expression was thoughtful. Just thinking about how much has changed in 10 days. Everything's changed, Lydia said quietly. Not everything. Caleb's gaze didn't waver. You're still the woman who stood in that chapel and said, I do, even though you were terrified. You're still the woman who fired a warning shot at armed men to protect herself. That hasn't changed. Maybe not, Lydia said. But I'm not the same woman who thought she was being led to slaughter. What are you now? Lydia considered the question. She thought about the past 10 days, about learning to trust a man the whole territory feared, about discovering strength she hadn't known she possessed, about standing her ground when everything in her screamed to run. I'm the woman who fights back, she said. Caleb smiled. It was the first real smile she'd seen from him, and it transformed his face, softening the hard lines, lighting something warm in those storm-gray eyes. Good, he said, because that's the woman who's going to walk into Red Hollow tomorrow and make Grant Mercer regret he ever tried to own you. They rose in the dark hours before dawn, moving through the cabin with practiced efficiency. Caleb saddled the horses while Lydia banked the fire and secured the cabin. She stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at the space that had become her refuge, her sanctuary, her home in ways she hadn't expected. Ready? Caleb called from outside. Lydia took a breath, touched the gold band on her finger, and stepped into the cold morning air. Ready. The mining road was exactly as rough as Caleb had promised. It climbed through dense timber, crossed rock slides that made the horses nervous, and switchbacked up the western ridge until Lydia's thighs burned from gripping the saddle. But Caleb navigated it with the confidence of a man who'd ridden every trail in these mountains. And by the time the sun cleared the eastern peaks, they'd left Mercer's watchers far behind. They stopped once to rest the horses and eat a cold breakfast of bread and dried meat. Lydia sat on a fallen log, looking out over the valley below where Red Hollow was just visible as a smudge of smoke and buildings in the distance. Nervous? Caleb asked, settling beside her. Terrified, Lydia admitted. But not of the town, of what happens if this doesn't work. It'll work, Caleb said. Trust me. I do, Lydia said, and realized she meant it. They rode into Red Hollow just after noon, approaching from the west as planned. The town looked exactly as Lydia remembered. The main street lined with false front buildings, the church steeple rising above the general store, the saloon on the corner where men gathered to drink and trade news. But everything felt different now. She wasn't the frightened ranch girl being hauled to her doom. She was a woman with a purpose, a plan, and a man beside her who'd proven he'd stand against hell itself to keep her safe. People stopped to stare as they rode past. Caleb kept his eyes forward, his posture relaxed but alert. Lydia sat straight in her saddle, wearing the blue wool dress and her mother's shawl, her hair braided and pinned, her chin high. They rode directly to the sheriff's office. Sheriff Tom Brennan was a weathered man in his 50s, with iron-gray hair and eyes that had seen too much trouble to be easily surprised. He stepped out onto the boardwalk as Caleb and Lydia dismounted, his hand resting casually on his gun belt. "Rourke," he said, "heard you got married." "You heard right," Caleb replied. "Sheriff Brennan, this is my wife, Lydia." Brennan's eyes flicked to Lydia, assessing. "Mrs. Rourke, welcome back to Red Hollow." "Thank you, Sheriff," Lydia said, her voice steady. "I assume this isn't a social call," Brennan said. "It's not," Caleb confirmed. "We need to file a formal complaint against Grant Mercer for attempted abduction and making threats with intent to harm. And we need it on record that Lydia and I are legally married and that she's here of her own free will." Brennan's expression didn't change, but something shifted behind his eyes. "That's serious business, Rourke. You got evidence?" "We've got witness testimony, mine and Lydia's. We've got the marriage certificate. And we've got 2 of Mercer's men currently camped on the Eastern Trail, preventing free passage." Caleb's voice was calm but firm. "What we need from you is to make this official. Because when Mercer comes, and he will come, I want it clear that any action he takes is illegal and will be met with appropriate force." Brennan studied them both for a long moment. Then he nodded. "Come inside. Let's get this down on paper." The sheriff's office was small and cramped, smelling of old coffee and gun oil. Brennan cleared a space at his desk and pulled out a ledger, dipping his pen in ink. "Start from the beginning," he said, "and don't leave anything out." Caleb did most of the talking, laying out the timeline with precise detail. Thomas Hale's initial debt to Mercer, the contract that promised Lydia as collateral, Caleb's decision to marry her to void the contract, Mercer's visit to the cabin with armed men, the threats made. Brennan wrote it all down, occasionally asking questions, his face unreadable. When Caleb finished, Brennan looked at Lydia. "That match your understanding of events, Mrs. Rourke?" "It does," Lydia said, "and I want it on record that I entered this marriage freely. My husband has treated me with nothing but respect. Any claim Grant Mercer makes to the contrary is a lie." Brennan wrote that down too. When he finished, he set his pen aside and leaned back in his chair. "I'll be honest with you both," he said. "This puts me in a difficult position. Mercer's got influence in this town. He's got lawyers, he's got money, and he's got friends in the territorial government. If I act on this complaint, I'm making an enemy." "If you don't act on it," Caleb said quietly, "you're letting a man get away with attempting to abduct a woman against her will. That's not influence, Sheriff. That's corruption." Brennan's jaw tightened. For a moment, Lydia thought he might order them out of his office. But then he stood and walked to the window, looking out at the street. "My daughter's 16, he said. "Smart girl, wants to be a teacher. I look at her and I think about what kind of territory I'm leaving for her to grow up in, whether it's going to be a place where the law means something or where men with money can do whatever they damn well please." He turned back to face them. "I'll file the complaint, and I'll ride out to Mercer's ranch today to inform him that any attempt to interfere with you or your wife will result in charges. But I can't promise that'll stop him. You understand that?" "I understand," Caleb said, "but it changes the game. It means he can't act without consequences, and that might be enough to make him think twice." Brennan nodded slowly. "Where are you staying while you're in town?" "The boarding house, if they'll have us," Lydia said. "They'll have you," Brennan said. "I'll make sure of it, and I'll spread the word that you're here as legal residents, not fugitives. That should help with the gossip." Caleb extended his hand. "Thank you, Sheriff." Brennan shook it. "Don't thank me yet. This isn't over. Not by a long shot." They left the sheriff's office and walked their horses down the street toward the boarding house. People watched from windows, from doorways, from the shelter of awnings. Lydia could feel their judgment, their curiosity, their fear. Let them look. She was done being ashamed. Mrs. Sullivan, who ran the boarding house, was a tiny woman with steel-gray hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing. She took in Lydia's appearance, Caleb's protective stance, and the set of their shoulders and made her decision in seconds. "I've got a room on the second floor," she said. "Clean sheets, hot water for washing, meals at 6 and 8. No drinking, no fighting, no trouble." "We're not here for trouble," Caleb said. "That's what everyone says," Mrs. Sullivan replied, but she handed him the key. "Payments up front." Caleb paid. Mrs. Sullivan counted the money, nodded, and gestured toward the stairs. "Second door on the right. And Mrs. Rourke? You need anything, you come find me. I don't care what the town thinks of your husband. You're under my roof now, and that means you're under my protection." Lydia felt unexpected tears prick her eyes. "Thank you." Mrs. Sullivan waved her off. "Go get settled. Supper's at 6. The room was simple but comfortable. A double bed with a patchwork quilt, a washstand, a window that looked out over the street. Caleb set their bags down and moved to the window, scanning the street below. "We should stay in tonight," he said. "Let word spread that we're here. Tomorrow we'll visit the land office, make sure our marriage is registered with the territory. The more official records we create, the harder it is for Mercer to claim otherwise." Lydia nodded, suddenly exhausted. The ride, the confrontation with the sheriff, the weight of being back in Red Hollow, it all crashed over her at once. Caleb must have seen it in her face because he crossed to her and placed a hand on her shoulder. "You did well today," he said gently. "Better than well. You stood in front of the law and claimed your own life. That took courage." "I'm tired of being brave," Lydia whispered. "I know, but we're almost through this. A few more days, and Mercer's claim will be buried so deep he'll never dig it out." Lydia looked up at him, at the face she'd once feared and now trusted more than any other. "And then?" "And then you decide what comes next," Caleb said, "just like I promised." There was a knock at the door. Caleb's hand went instinctively to his sidearm, but the voice that called through was female and familiar. "It's Mrs. Sullivan. I've brought fresh water." Caleb opened the door. Mrs. Sullivan bustled in with a pitcher and basin, setting them on the washstand. But she didn't leave immediately. Instead, she looked at Lydia with something like understanding. "The town's talking," she said bluntly. "They're saying Rourke forced you into this marriage. They're saying you're here under duress. Some are even saying Mercer's got a right to claim you back." Lydia straightened. "None of that is true." "I believe you," Mrs. Sullivan said. "But you're going to need to make the rest of them believe it too. And the best way to do that is to show them. Be seen together. Talk to people. Let them see that you're not a prisoner." "We will," Lydia said. Mrs. Sullivan nodded and headed for the door, but she paused on the threshold. "My husband was a mountain man. Trapped beaver up in the high country before the trade dried up. People feared him too, said he was wild, dangerous, uncivilized, but he was the gentlest man I ever knew. Treated me like I was made of spun glass and steel all at once." She looked at Caleb. "I see that same quality in you, Mr. Rourke. Don't let this town's judgment make you forget it." She left before either of them could respond. Lydia sat on the edge of the bed, her hands in her lap. Caleb remained by the window, but his shoulders had relaxed slightly. "She's right," Lydia said. "We need to show them. Tomorrow we should walk through town together. Visit the general store, the church, anywhere people gather. Let them see us as we are." "As we are," Caleb repeated quietly. "And what are we, Lydia?" She met his eyes across the small room. "We're two people who chose each other when no one else would," she said. "We're two people who stood together when it would have been easier to run. That's the truth. That's what they need to see." Caleb crossed the room and sat beside her on the bed, careful to keep space between them. "Tomorrow," he said, "we show them the truth, and we let Grant Mercer know that his time is up." Lydia nodded, feeling something fierce and determined settle in her chest. Tomorrow, the real fight would begin. But tonight, for the first time in her life, she wasn't facing it alone. They woke to the sound of church bells ringing across Red Hollow, calling the faithful to Sunday service. Lydia lay still for a moment, disoriented by the unfamiliar room, the softer mattress, the absence of mountain silence. Beside her, the other half of the bed was empty but still warm. She could hear water being poured in the wash basin across the room. Caleb stood with his back to her, washing his face and neck, his shirt hanging loose over his shoulders. The morning light caught the scars that crossed his back, old wounds, long healed, but numerous enough to tell a story Lydia suspected she'd never hear in full. He must have sensed her watching because he turned, reaching for a towel. "Didn't mean to wake you," he said quietly. "The bells did that." Lydia sat up, smoothing her hair. "What time is it?" "Just past 7. Service starts at 8. Caleb pulled on his shirt, buttoning it with practiced efficiency. "I'm thinking we should attend." Lydia blinked. "Church?" "Best way to show the town we're a legitimate couple. Everyone will be there, including the people whose opinions matter. And it's harder for Mercer to make accusations when we're sitting in the house of worship beside the same people he needs to convince." It was strategic. It was smart. It was also terrifying. "I haven't been to church since my mother died," Lydia said. Caleb paused, his hands stilling on the buttons. "We don't have to go if you're not ready." "No." Lydia stood, moving to the wash basin. "You're right. We need to be seen. And if I'm going to face this town's judgment, I might as well do it somewhere they can't whisper without being heard." She washed quickly and dressed in the blue wool, pinning her hair up with more care than usual. When she turned, Caleb was watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "What?" she asked. "You look like yourself," he said, "not like someone trying to be someone else." "That's good. They need to see the real you." "The real me is scared," Lydia admitted. "The real you is brave," Caleb corrected. "There's a difference." They walked to church together, Caleb's hand resting lightly at the small of Lydia's back, proprietary but not possessive. The gesture felt strange and right all at once, like stepping into a role she'd been rehearsing without knowing it. People turned to stare as they passed, conversations dying mid-sentence, curtains twitching in windows. The church stood at the end of Main Street, its white paint peeling but its steeple still proud against the morning sky. Reverend Hayes stood at the door, greeting parishioners as they entered. When he saw Caleb and Lydia approaching, his weathered face creased into something between a smile and concern. "Mr. and Mrs. Rourke," he said, extending his hand to Caleb. "I'm glad to see you both." "Reverend," Caleb said, shaking his hand firmly. Hayes turned to Lydia, and his expression softened. "How are you, my dear?" "I'm well, Reverend," Lydia said, and meant it. Something in her voice must have convinced him because he nodded slowly. "I'm glad to hear it. Please, come in. There's space in the third pew." The church was already half full, families settling into their usual spots, children squirming in their Sunday clothes. When Caleb and Lydia entered, a hush fell over the congregation that had nothing to do with reverence. Lydia felt every eye turned toward them, felt the weight of speculation and judgment pressing down like physical force. Caleb's hand found hers. He didn't squeeze, didn't offer false comfort. He just held her hand as they walked down the aisle to the third pew, their footsteps echoing on the wooden floor. They sat together, and Caleb released her hand only to pick up a hymnal, offering it to her first before taking one for himself. The gesture was small, almost insignificant, but Lydia saw Mrs. Pruitt in the second row notice it, saw the blacksmith's wife nudge her husband and whisper something, saw old Mr. Chen, who ran the general store, nod slightly as if confirming something to himself. These were the details that would matter, the small kindnesses, the ordinary courtesies of a marriage built on respect rather than force. Reverend Hayes began the service with a prayer for the community, for strength in difficult times, for wisdom in judgment. His voice filled the small church, familiar and steady. Lydia found herself relaxing slightly, the ritual of standing and sitting, of singing hymns she'd known since childhood, creating a rhythm that soothed her nerves. When it came time for the sermon, Hayes opened his Bible to the book of Ruth. "Whither thou goest, I will go," he read, his voice carrying to the rafters. "And where thou lodgest, I will lodge. Thy people shall be my people." Lydia felt Caleb's attention sharpen beside her, though his expression remained neutral. Hayes closed the Bible and looked out over his congregation. "We talk a lot about faith in this church. Faith in the divine, faith in providence, faith in salvation. But there's another kind of faith we don't discuss as often, the faith we place in each other. The trust we extend when we choose to bind our lives together, for better or worse, in sickness and health, till death do us part. He let the words settle. Marriage is an act of faith, Hayes continued. It's choosing to believe in someone's essential goodness, even when the world tells you to be afraid. It's standing beside someone when it would be easier to walk away. And it's defending that choice against those who would tear it down out of prejudice, fear, or greed. Lydia's throat tightened. She didn't dare look around, didn't want to see the reactions of the people who'd condemned her marriage before it had even begun. I've been asked by some members of this community to speak against a marriage that took place in this very church, Hayes said bluntly, to declare it invalid, coerced, or morally wrong. But I stand before you today to say that I will not. I witnessed the vows spoken between Caleb Rourke and Lydia Hale. I saw two people who understood the gravity of what they were undertaking, and I blessed their union because I believe that sometimes deliverance comes in unexpected forms. The silence in the church was absolute. We fear what we don't understand, Hayes said. We judge what makes us uncomfortable. But I challenge each of you today to examine your own hearts. Are you condemning this marriage because you truly believe it's wrong? Or because it challenges your assumptions about who deserves love, protection, and dignity? He let the question hang in the air. Let those who have never made a choice born of desperation cast the first stone. Let those who have never needed help they didn't deserve offer the first condemnation. But if you've ever been afraid, ever been vulnerable, ever been in need of grace, then extend that same grace to your neighbors. Hayes opened his Bible again and continued with the service, but Lydia barely heard the rest of it. Her heart was pounding, her hands trembling. Beside her, Caleb sat perfectly still, his jaw tight, his eyes fixed straight ahead. When the service ended and people began to file out, Lydia braced herself for confrontation. But instead, something unexpected happened. Mrs. Sullivan approached first, her small frame somehow commanding in the crowded aisle. "That was a fine sermon," she said to Hayes, then turned to Lydia. "You're looking well, dear. Marriage agrees with you." Before Lydia could respond, Mr. Chen stepped forward. "Mrs. Rourke, I wanted to invite you and your husband to stop by the store this week. I'm expecting a shipment of fabric from Denver. Thought you might like first look." Thank you, Mr. Chen," Lydia managed. Others followed. Not everyone, not even most, but enough. The blacksmith's wife offered a tentative smile. A young woman Lydia remembered from school congratulated her quietly. An older rancher nodded to Caleb with something like respect. They were still in the minority. Lydia could see the clusters of people who turned away, who whispered behind their hands, who looked at her with pity or contempt. But the ice had cracked. The absolute certainty of her condemnation had fractured. It was a start. They emerged from the church into brilliant sunshine. Caleb guided Lydia away from the lingering groups, his hand once again at her back, protective but allowing her to set the pace. "That went better than expected," he said quietly. "The Reverend took a risk," Lydia replied, "defending us like that." "Hayes is a good man, one of the few." Caleb's eyes scanned the street, always watchful. But words in church are one thing. What matters is what happens when Mercer makes his move. As if summoned by the mention of his name, a rider appeared at the end of Main Street. He wasn't Mercer, but Lydia recognized him from the cabin, one of the hired guns who'd flanked the land baron during his threat. The man rode slowly, deliberately, his eyes finding Caleb and Lydia with predatory precision. He reined in his horse directly in front of them. "Rourke," he said, "Mr. Mercer requests the pleasure of your company. Both of you, at his ranch, this afternoon." "Not interested," Caleb said flatly. The gunman smiled without warmth. "Mr. Mercer thought you might say that, so he asked me to deliver a message. He's willing to settle this matter peacefully, through proper legal channels. But if you refuse to meet with him, he'll have no choice but to pursue more aggressive remedies. Tell Mercer that we've already filed a formal complaint with Sheriff Brennan," Lydia said, her voice steady despite the fear coiling in her stomach. "Any aggressive remedies he pursues will be met with legal consequences." The gunman's smile widened. "The sheriff's a reasonable man. I'm sure he'll see things Mr. Mercer's way once all the facts are presented." "The facts are already on record," Caleb said. Now move along before you're cited for harassment." The gunman's hand drifted toward his sidearm. Around them, the churchgoers who'd been lingering on the street began to back away, sensing violence in the air like animals sensing a storm. "Careful, Rourke," the gunman said softly. "You might be able to hide behind that woman's skirts in a courtroom, but out here you're just a man who's made some powerful enemies." "And you're just a man who talks too much," Caleb replied. His voice was quiet, almost conversational, but there was steel beneath it. "You've delivered your message. Now ride out while you still can." For a long moment, the two men stared at each other, and Lydia could feel the violence hovering between them like heat shimmer on summer stones. Then Sheriff Brennan's voice cut through the tension. "Is there a problem here?" The sheriff stood on the boardwalk outside his office, his hand resting on his gun belt, his expression hard. The gunman's eyes flicked to Brennan, calculating. Then he tipped his hat in mock courtesy. "No problem, Sheriff. Just delivering an invitation?" "Then I suggest you deliver it and move along," Brennan said. "We don't tolerate intimidation in Red Hollow, not even from Mr. Mercer's employees." The gunman's jaw tightened, but he nodded and turned his horse. "Mr. Mercer will be expecting you at 3 o'clock, he called back to Caleb and Lydia. "Don't disappoint him." He spurred his horse and rode out of town, leaving dust and unease in his wake. Brennan walked over to where Caleb and Lydia stood. "You all right?" "Fine," Caleb said. "But Mercer's not backing down." "Didn't think he would," Brennan admitted. "I rode out to his ranch yesterday like I said I would, served him with notice of your complaint. He listened politely, thanked me for my time, and then his lawyers showed me a stack of documents they claim prove he has legal standing to contest your marriage." Lydia's heart sank. "What kind of documents?" "Contracts, affidavits, witness statements. They're claiming your father entered into a binding agreement on your behalf, and that you were aware of it at the time." Brennan held up a hand before Lydia could protest. "I don't believe it. But they've got signatures, dates, everything that looks official. It's going to come down to a judge's decision." "When?" Caleb asked. "Territorial magistrate comes through next month. Until then, you're both free to go about your business. But I'd advise staying close to town, where I can keep an eye on things. And I'd advise not meeting with Mercer without legal representation." "We have no intention of meeting with him at all," Lydia said firmly. Brennan nodded approvingly. "Smart. But be careful. Mercer's not used to being told no, and desperate men do desperate things." They spent the rest of the day making themselves visible in Red Hollow. They walked through the general store, where Mr. Chen made good on his promise to show Lydia the new fabric. They stopped at the boarding house for lunch, eating in the common room where other residents could see them talking quietly, sharing a meal like any married couple. They even visited the land office, where a board clerk registered their marriage in the territorial records without comment. Each interaction was a small victory, a piece of evidence that their marriage was real and freely chosen. But beneath it all, Lydia felt the weight of what was coming. Mercer wouldn't give up. He'd invested too much, risked too much, to walk away empty-handed. And when he moved against them, it wouldn't be with polite invitations or legal documents. It would be with violence. That evening, they returned to their room at the boarding house. Caleb checked the window locks, tested the door, and positioned a chair so he'd hear if anyone tried to enter during the night. His movements were automatic, ingrained by years of sleeping in dangerous places. Lydia watched him from where she sat on the edge of the bed. "You think he'll come tonight?" "No," Caleb said. "He'll wait until he's exhausted his legal options. Mercer likes to maintain the appearance of legitimacy for as long as possible. But when those options run out, he'll act, and we need to be ready." "How do you get ready for something like that?" Caleb crossed to his saddlebags and pulled out a small revolver. He checked the cylinder, verified the ammunition, and then held it out to Lydia. "You know how to use one of these?" "My father taught me," Lydia said, "before he decided I was worth more as currency than as a daughter." The bitterness in her voice surprised even her. Caleb noticed but didn't comment on it. Instead, he placed the revolver in her hands. "Keep this with you, not in your bag, on your person. If something happens, if we get separated, I need to know you can defend yourself." Lydia's fingers closed around the grip. The weight was familiar, solid, grounding. "I won't let him take me." "I know," Caleb said, "but promise me something." "What?" "If it comes down to a choice between your safety and mine, you choose yours. You run. You get to Sheriff Brennan or Reverend Hayes or anyone who can protect you, and you don't look back. His eyes were intense, urgent. Promise me, Lydia. I'm not going to leave you to face Mercer alone. Promise me, Caleb insisted, because I can't do what needs to be done if I'm worried about you. And what needs to be done is keeping you alive and free, even if that means I don't walk away from this. Lydia's throat tightened. That's not acceptable. It's the only thing that's acceptable, Caleb said quietly. You didn't ask for any of this. You didn't choose to have your life traded like livestock. But you get to choose what happens next. And I need you to choose survival, Lydia. Your survival, not mine. She wanted to argue, wanted to tell him that she wouldn't abandon him the way everyone else in his life seemed to have done. But the look in his eyes stopped her. This wasn't a request. It was the condition on which he'd agreed to protect her in the first place. I promise, she whispered. Caleb nodded, some of the tension leaving his shoulders. Good. They settled into an uneasy silence. Caleb took the chair by the window, his rifle across his knees, his eyes on the darkening street below. Lydia lay on the bed fully clothed, the revolver tucked into the pocket of her skirt, her mind too restless for sleep. Caleb? She said into the darkness. Yeah? What you said earlier about not fitting anywhere after the war, do you still feel that way? She heard him shift in the chair. Sometimes. Most times. Do you feel that way now? The question hung between them. Outside, a dog barked. Somewhere down the street, a piano played a melancholy tune. No, Caleb said finally. Right now, I feel like I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be. Lydia's eyes burned with tears she refused to shed. Me too. The night passed without incident, but morning brought news that changed everything. Mrs. Sullivan knocked on their door just after dawn, her face pale. You need to come downstairs. The sheriff's here. Brennan stood in the boarding house parlor, his hat in his hands, his expression grim. When he saw Caleb and Lydia, he gestured for them to sit. I got word an hour ago, he said without preamble. Judge Morrison is coming through Red Hollow 3 weeks early. He'll be here tomorrow to hear Mercer's petition to annul your marriage and enforce the original contract. Lydia felt the floor tilt beneath her. Tomorrow? Mercer pulled strings, called in favors. Morrison's one of the territorial judges who's sympathetic to property rights claims, especially when they involve debt settlement. Brennan's jaw tightened. I'm sorry. I should have anticipated this. Can we get our own lawyer? Caleb asked. In Red Hollow? No one's going to go up against Mercer's legal team, and there's no time to bring someone in from outside. Brennan looked at them both. You're going to have to represent yourselves, which means you need to be prepared to tell your story clearly, honestly, and in a way that makes the judge believe you. Lydia's mind raced. 24 hours. They had 24 hours to build a case strong enough to overcome Mercer's money, influence, and falsified documents. It wasn't enough time. But it was all they had. What do we need? She asked. Witnesses, Brennan said. People who can testify that you entered this marriage freely, that Rourke's treated you well, that there's no coercion. Reverend Hayes, Caleb said immediately. He'll help, Brennan agreed. But you'll need more than that. You'll need people from the community who've seen you together, who can speak to the legitimacy of your relationship. Lydia thought of the people who'd approached them after church. Mrs. Sullivan, Mr. Chen, the blacksmith's wife. It was a thin thread to hang a life on, but it was what they had. We'll find them, she said. Brennan nodded. I'll do what I can from my end. I've filed my own report about Mercer's threats and the armed men on your property. It won't be enough to stop the hearing, but it might give the judge pause. He stood, replacing his hat. Court's set for 10 o'clock tomorrow morning. Be there early and be ready for Mercer to fight dirty. After Brennan left, Caleb and Lydia sat in the parlor, the weight of what was coming pressing down on them like stones. We should split up, Caleb said. Cover more ground. You talk to the women, Mrs. Sullivan, the shopkeepers, anyone who might be sympathetic. I'll talk to the men who saw us at church, see if any of them are willing to stand up in court. And if we can't find enough witnesses, Caleb's expression was hard. Then we have to convince the judge through your testimony alone. You'll need to tell him what your father did. What Mercer tried to do. Why you chose to marry me. The truth, Lydia said. The truth, Caleb agreed, but presented in a way that leaves no room for doubt, no hesitation, no weakness. You have to make Judge Morrison believe that you'd rather die than be handed over to Grant Mercer. Lydia met his eyes. That's not a performance, Caleb. That's exactly how I feel. Something shifted in his expression, pride maybe, or recognition. Then that's what you tell him. They spent the day moving through Red Hollow like soldiers preparing for battle, gathering allies, building defenses, preparing for the fight that would determine everything. Lydia spoke to every woman who'd shown her even the smallest kindness, explaining what was at stake, asking for their help. Some turned her away. Others made excuses. But a few, Mrs. Sullivan, the blacksmith's wife Sarah, young Emma Chen, who worked in her father's store, agreed to testify. Caleb had less success. Most of the men were either afraid of Mercer's retaliation or convinced that Lydia belonged to whoever held her father's debt. But Reverend Hayes agreed without hesitation, and old Tom Brennan's word carried weight, even if he couldn't testify directly. By evening, they had 5 potential witnesses. It would have to be enough, too. They ate dinner in their room, neither of them hungry but both forcing down food for strength. Tomorrow would be brutal, and they needed to be ready. Thank you, Lydia said suddenly. Caleb looked up from his untouched plate. For what? For not giving up. For fighting for this even though you had every reason to walk away. She paused. I know you didn't ask for any of this either. You could have ignored my father, let Mercer take me, stayed safe in your mountain cabin, but you didn't. I couldn't, Caleb said simply. Once I knew what Mercer intended, there was no choice. Not for me. Why? Lydia asked. What made you care about a woman you'd never met? Caleb was quiet for a long moment, his hands still on the table, his eyes distant. My sister, he said finally. I had a younger sister, Rebecca. After the war, I came home and found out she'd gotten into debt trying to keep our parents' farm running while I was gone. A man from back east bought the debt and showed up to collect. He said she could work it off in his household. Caleb's voice was flat, emotionless, which somehow made it worse. She was 16. I tried to stop it, but the law was on his side. I watched them take her away, and there wasn't a damn thing I could do about it. Lydia's heart cracked. What happened to her? I don't know, Caleb said. I tried to find her, spent 2 years tracking leads, following rumors, but she vanished into the east like she'd never existed. I failed her, Lydia. I failed to protect her when it mattered most. He finally looked up, and the pain in his eyes was raw, unguarded. So when your father told me what Mercer planned, I saw Rebecca, and I swore I wouldn't fail again. Lydia reached across the table and took his hand. You didn't fail her. The system failed her. The law failed her. Men like Mercer failed her. Maybe, Caleb said, but I still couldn't save her. I can save you, though. You, and I will, Lydia, no matter what it costs. She held his hand tighter, feeling the calluses, the scars, the strength that had been forged in loss and tempered in determination. We'll save each other, she said. Tomorrow, we walk into that courtroom together, and we walk out together. That's the only acceptable outcome. Caleb's fingers curled around hers. Together, he agreed. They sat like that as the light faded from the window, 2 people bound together by circumstance and choice, preparing to face a battle that would determine not just their future, but their freedom. Outside, Red Hollow settled into evening quiet. But in a ranch house 5 miles south, Grant Mercer sat with his lawyers, preparing his own strategy. And tomorrow, when the sun rose over the Montana Territory, the real war would begin. The courthouse in Red Hollow was little more than a converted meeting hall with a judge's bench at one end and rows of wooden chairs facing it. By 9:30 in the morning, every seat was filled. Word had spread through town like wildfire. The mountain man's marriage would be tested, Mercer's claim would be heard, and the future of Thomas Hale's daughter would be decided by a judge from outside the territory who owed nothing to anyone local. Lydia sat in the front row beside Caleb, her hands folded in her lap to keep them from shaking. She wore the blue wool dress again, her hair pinned up simply. No adornment except her wedding band. Caleb sat rigid beside her in his only suit, borrowed from Reverend Hayes and slightly too small across the shoulders. He'd shaved carefully that morning, transforming himself from mountain man to something approaching respectable, though the scars on his face and the wariness in his eyes couldn't be hidden. Behind them, their small collection of witnesses waited nervously. Mrs. Sullivan in her Sunday best, lips pressed into a determined line. Sarah, the blacksmith's wife, clutching her husband's hand. Emma Chen, barely 18, looking terrified but resolute. Reverend Hayes sat closest to the aisle, his Bible in his lap, his weathered face calm. On the opposite side of the room, Grant Mercer held court like a king in his territory. He wore an expensive suit tailored in Denver, his silver hair perfectly combed, his smile confident and cold. 3 lawyers surrounded him, their briefcases bulging with documents. Behind them sat a dozen of Red Hollow's wealthier citizens, men who owed Mercer favors, men who hoped to curry favor, men who believed that property rights trumped human dignity. Between the 2 camps, the town watched and waited. Sheriff Brennan stood at the back of the room, positioned where he could see everything. When he caught Lydia's eye, he gave her a slight nod. It was the only encouragement she'd get. At precisely 10 o'clock, Judge Ambrose Morrison entered through the side door. He was a man in his 60s, tall and spare, with iron gray hair and a face that looked like it had never smiled. He wore his black robes like armor and carried himself with the absolute authority of someone who'd spent 40 years deciding other people's fates. He took his seat at the bench without ceremony and surveyed the packed courtroom with cool, analytical eyes. "This is a hearing, not a trial," he announced, his voice carrying easily through the small space. "I'm here to determine the validity of a marriage contract and to adjudicate competing claims regarding the person of Mrs. Lydia Hale Rourke. We will proceed with order and efficiency. Any disruption will result in removal from this courtroom." His gaze swept across both sides. "Mr. Mercer, as the petitioner, you may present your case." Mercer's lead attorney stood, a man named Caldwell with thin lips and calculating eyes. "Thank you, Your Honor. We will demonstrate that the marriage between Caleb Rourke and Lydia Hale is invalid on the grounds of prior contract and duress, and that our client, Mr. Grant Mercer, holds legitimate claim to guardianship of Miss Hale until her father's debts are satisfied." Caldwell moved to a table where documents were laid out with theatrical precision. "Your Honor, we submit into evidence a promissory note dated March 15th of this year, signed by Thomas Hale and witnessed by 2 citizens of Red Hollow, in which Mr. Hale pledges his daughter Lydia Hale in marriage to Mr. Grant Mercer as settlement for debts totaling $8,000. The number hit Lydia like a physical blow. $8,000. Her father had sold her for $8,000. Caldwell continued smoothly. "We further submit correspondence between Mr. Hale and Miss Hale, in which the arrangement was discussed, and we contend, acknowledged by Miss Hale herself." "That's a lie," Lydia said, her voice cutting through the courtroom before she could stop herself. Judge Morrison's gaze shifted to her. "You will have your opportunity to speak, Mrs. Rourke. Mr. Caldwell, proceed." Caldwell smiled thinly and produced a letter. "This correspondence, dated April 2nd, shows Miss Hale responding to her father's financial difficulties and expressing her willingness to do whatever is necessary to help the family. We contend this constitutes acknowledgement of the arrangement." Lydia's blood ran cold. She remembered that letter. She'd written it after her father had confessed the ranch was failing, when she'd thought he meant she should help with the books, take in sewing, find work in town. She'd never imagined he meant this. "Furthermore," Caldwell said, "we will demonstrate that the marriage to Mr. Rourke was conducted under duress, without proper courtship or engagement period, and with the specific intent of defrauding Mr. Mercer of his legitimate claim. We have witnesses who will testify that Miss Hale appeared frightened at her wedding, that she was removed from Red Hollow immediately afterward, and that she has been held in isolation in the mountains by a man with a documented history of violence." Caleb's hands clenched on his knees, but his face remained impassive. Caldwell called his first witness, Mrs. Pruitt, the woman who'd sat in the church pews clutching her Bible like a weapon. She took the stand with the air of someone performing a civic duty. "Mrs. Pruitt, you attended the wedding of Caleb Rourke and Lydia Hale, did you not?" "I did," she said, her voice prim. "Can you describe Miss Hale's demeanor during the ceremony?" She looked terrified, Mrs. Pruitt said without hesitation. White as a sheet, trembling. I thought she might faint. And Mr. Rourke, well, he stood there like a stone, not a hint of affection or tenderness. It was the coldest wedding I've ever witnessed. Did you observe any interaction between the bride and groom that suggested a genuine romantic attachment? None whatsoever. He didn't even kiss her at the end, just nodded and walked out like she was a package he'd collected. Caldwell nodded sympathetically. Thank you, Mrs. Pruitt. Your witness, Mr. Rourke. Caleb stood slowly. He had no legal training, no experience cross-examining witnesses, but he approached Mrs. Pruitt with the same careful intensity he brought to tracking game in the high country. Mrs. Pruitt, you said my wife looked frightened at our wedding. That's right. Did you speak to her beforehand? Ask her how she felt? Confirm she was frightened? Mrs. Pruitt shifted in her seat. Well, no, but it was obvious. So you assumed, Caleb interrupted. Based on her appearance, you made an assumption about her state of mind. Well, any woman would be frightened marrying a man like you, Mrs. Pruitt said sharply. A man like me, Caleb repeated. You mean a man with scars? A man who lives in the mountains? A man who doesn't fit your idea of what a husband should be? I mean a man with your reputation, Mrs. Pruitt shot back. And what is my reputation, Mrs. Pruitt? Have I ever harmed you, threatened you, committed any crime in Red Hollow? Well, no, but everyone knows, everyone assumes, Caleb said quietly. Just like you assumed my wife was frightened. Just like you assumed our marriage couldn't be genuine because it didn't look like the marriages you approve of. He paused. Did it occur to you that maybe she was nervous because the whole town was staring at her? That maybe I didn't kiss her because I respect her privacy and dignity? Or did those explanations not fit the story you'd already decided was true? Mrs. Pruitt's face flushed red. I know what I saw. You saw what you expected to see, Caleb said. He turned to Judge Morrison. No further questions. Morrison's expression gave nothing away, but Lydia thought she saw a flicker of interest in his eyes. Caldwell called two more witnesses, the owner of the feed store who claimed Thomas Hale had mentioned the arrangement, and one of Mercer's ranch hands who swore he'd heard Lydia crying in the wagon as Caleb took her away from town. Caleb dismantled their testimony with quiet, relentless questions that exposed assumptions, hearsay, and convenient memory. Then Caldwell played his final card. Your Honor, we call Thomas Hale to the stand. A collective gasp went through the courtroom. Lydia's head snapped toward the back of the room where the door was opening. Her father walked in, hat in hand, shoulders slumped, looking like he'd aged 10 years since she'd last seen him. He wouldn't meet her eyes as he took the stand. Caldwell approached him with manufactured sympathy. Mr. Hale, this must be difficult for you. Please tell the court about the arrangement you made with Mr. Mercer. Thomas Hale's voice was barely audible. I was desperate. The ranch was failing. I had debts I couldn't pay. Mercer offered to clear everything if I agreed to a marriage contract between him and my daughter. And did you discuss this arrangement with your daughter? I tried to, Thomas said, still not looking at Lydia. I told her we had money troubles. I told her she might need to help. Did she agree to help? She said she'd do whatever was necessary. So she knew, Caldwell said triumphantly. She knew about the arrangement and agreed to it. No, Thomas said suddenly, and for the first time, his voice held strength. She didn't know. I didn't tell her what I'd done. I didn't tell her I'd promised her to Mercer because I was too much of a coward to watch her face when she learned what I'd become. Caldwell's smile faltered. Mr. Hale, I let my daughter down, Thomas continued, his voice breaking. I betrayed her trust. I sold her like livestock because I couldn't face losing the ranch. And then when Mercer came to collect, I went to Rourke, not because I wanted to protect her, but because I wanted to protect myself from what I'd done. He finally looked at Lydia, and his eyes were wet. I'm sorry. I know it doesn't fix anything, but I'm sorry. The courtroom was silent. Caldwell recovered quickly. Your Honor, regardless of Mr. Hale's regrets, the contract remains valid. He had legal authority as her father to enter into this agreement. Did he? Caleb stood. Your Honor, I'd like to call my first witness. Morrison nodded. Proceed. I call Reverend Nathan Hayes. The Reverend took the stand with quiet dignity. Caleb approached him with respect. Reverend Hayes, you performed the marriage ceremony between myself and Lydia Hale. I did. Before you performed that ceremony, did you speak with Mrs. Rourke privately? Yes, it's my practice to counsel both parties before marriage to ensure they understand the commitment they're making. And what did Mrs. Rourke tell you? Hayes looked directly at Judge Morrison. She told me she was afraid, but not of Mr. Rourke. She told me her father had made arrangements she didn't understand and that Mr. Rourke had offered her a way out. She told me she was choosing this marriage freely because the alternative was worse than anything she could imagine. Did she seem coerced? Threatened? No, Hayes said firmly. She seemed like a woman making the best choice available to her in impossible circumstances. And when I asked her if she understood that marriage was a permanent commitment, she said, I understand, and I'm choosing it anyway. Caleb nodded. Thank you, Reverend. Your witness, Mr. Caldwell. Caldwell stood. Reverend Hayes, isn't it true that you have a personal relationship with Mr. Rourke, that you've known him for years? I've known him, yes. So your testimony might be biased in his favor. Hayes smiled slightly. Mr. Caldwell, I've been a minister for 37 years. I've counseled hundreds of couples before marriage. I can tell the difference between a woman being forced into something and a woman making a difficult choice with clear eyes. Miss Hale, Mrs. Rourke, knew exactly what she was doing, and I blessed that marriage because I believed it was right. Caldwell had no response to that. Caleb called Mrs. Sullivan next. She testified about Lydia's demeanor at the boarding house, about the respect she'd observed between husband and wife, about the small kindnesses that spoke to genuine care rather than possession. Then Sarah, the blacksmith's wife, who'd seen them at church. She wasn't afraid of him, Sarah said simply. I've seen women who are afraid of their husbands. They flinch when they're touched. They keep their eyes down. They make themselves small. Mrs. Rourke doesn't do any of that. She stands beside her husband like an equal. That's not fear. That's partnership. Emma Chen testified last, her voice trembling but clear. I talked to Mrs. Rourke at my father's store. I asked her if she was all right, if she needed help. She looked me straight in the eye and said, I'm exactly where I choose to be. And I believed her. When the witnesses were finished, Judge Morrison leaned back in his chair. Mr. Rourke, Mrs. Rourke, I'd like to hear from you directly. Mrs. Rourke, please take the stand. Lydia's legs felt like water as she stood. Caleb's hand brushed hers as she passed, brief contact, grounding her. She took the stand and placed her hand on the Bible the clerk offered. Morrison studied her. Mrs. Rourke, I've heard a great deal of testimony today about what other people think happened. I want to hear what you say happened. In your own words, tell me about your marriage. Lydia took a breath and let the truth pour out. My father made a deal with Grant Mercer without my knowledge or consent. He promised me in marriage to settle his debts. I didn't learn about it until Caleb Rourke came to our ranch and told my father he was wrong, that I wasn't property to be traded. When my father couldn't find another way out, he asked Mr. Rourke to marry me first, to make Mercer's contract invalid. She looked directly at Morrison. I was terrified at my wedding, not of Caleb Rourke, but of what would happen if I didn't go through with it. I knew that if I refused, Mercer would take me anyway. And I knew from the way people talked about him, from the way my father trembled when he said his name, that being claimed by Mercer would be worse than anything I could imagine. Lydia's hands gripped the rail in front of her. So I made a choice. I chose to marry a man I didn't know because he promised me something no one else had: respect, safety, and the right to decide my own future. And in the weeks since, he's kept every promise. He's never forced me, never threatened me, never treated me as anything less than a person with rights and dignity. She felt tears threaten, but pushed them back. My father had no right to promise me to anyone. I'm not chattel. I'm not currency. I'm a human being, and I chose my husband. That choice might not look like the marriages other people have, but it's mine, and it's real. Morrison was quiet for a long moment. Mr. Mercer's attorneys would argue that you made this choice under duress, that you were forced to choose between two bad options. I was, Lydia agreed, but I still chose. And choosing the better of two bad options is still choice, Your Honor. If you invalidate my marriage, you're not giving me freedom. You're taking away the only choice I ever got to make. Morrison nodded slowly. Mr. Caldwell, do you have questions for Mrs. Rourke? Caldwell stood, sensing weakness. Mrs. Rourke, how long did you know your husband before you married him? I met him the day of our wedding. And yet you expect this court to believe you entered into marriage freely with a complete stranger? I expect this court to believe I chose the unknown over the certainty of being owned by Grant Mercer, Lydia said. That's not naivety, Mr. Caldwell. That's survival. Survival, Caldwell repeated. Is that what marriage means to you? Survival? It did at first, Lydia admitted, but it means more than that now. Oh? And what does it mean now? Lydia looked at Caleb, sitting in the front row, his eyes steady on hers. It means partnership, she said quietly. It means being seen as a person, not property. It means having someone stand beside you when the whole world says you're not worth defending. It means choosing each other every day, not because you have to, but because you want to. Caldwell's expression hardened. Very pretty words, Mrs. Rourke, but this court deals in facts, not sentiment. The fact is, you married Mr. Rourke to avoid a legal obligation. That's fraud. The fact is, Lydia shot back, I married Mr. Rourke to avoid being sold to a man who views women as acquisitions. If preventing that is fraud, then I'm guilty. But I don't think it is, Mr. Caldwell. I think it's justice. Caldwell had no response. He returned to his seat, his jaw tight. Morrison turned to Caleb. Mr. Rourke, please take the stand. Caleb and Lydia passed each other in the aisle. His hand found hers for just a second, squeezing gently before he continued to the stand. Morrison studied him with the same analytical gaze he'd given Lydia. Mr. Rourke, you're aware that Mr. Mercer has made serious allegations about your character, that you're violent, unstable, dangerous. How do you respond to those allegations? They're partially true, Caleb said, and a murmur went through the courtroom. I was a soldier. I was a scout. I've killed men. I've seen and done things that changed me in ways I can't undo, but I've never raised a hand to a woman. I've never used force except in defense of life. And I've never treated my wife as anything less than my equal. Why did you agree to marry her? Because her father's contract with Mercer was an abomination, and I had the power to stop it. That's all? A sense of justice? Caleb was quiet for a moment. At first, yes. But somewhere between the wedding and now, it became about more than that. Explain. I married Lydia to protect her. But I've stayed married to her because she's the bravest person I've ever met. Because she stood up to armed men when she had every reason to run. Because she's made a home in a mountain cabin and never once complained about the life she didn't ask for. Because when I offered her the chance to leave, to go somewhere safe and start over, she chose to stay and fight. Caleb's eyes found Lydia in the front row. I don't know if that's love, he said quietly. I don't know if I have the right to call it that, but I know that I'd do anything to keep her safe and free. And I know that if this court takes her from me and gives her to Mercer, it'll be the second greatest failure of my life. Morrison leaned forward. The second? I had a sister, Caleb said. She was sold to pay debts, just like Mercer tried to do with Lydia. I couldn't save her, but I can save my wife. And I'm asking this court to let me do that. The courtroom was absolutely silent. Caldwell stood for cross-examination. Mr. Rourke, isn't it true that you have a personal vendetta against Grant Mercer, that you lost your job because of him? I lost my job because I testified against a man he'd hired to terrorize homesteaders, Caleb said flatly. If that makes me hold a grudge, guilty as charged. So you saw an opportunity for revenge and you took it by stealing his promised bride. I saw an opportunity to prevent an innocent woman from being victimized by a man who's made a career of victimizing the vulnerable. If you want to call that revenge, go ahead. I call it doing the right thing. Caldwell shifted tactics. Mr. Rourke, can you honestly say you've never touched your wife in anger? I've never touched her at all except when she's asked me to, Caleb said. We share a home, not a bed. We're married in law and in name, but I've given her space and privacy because those are things she deserves. The admission created another stir in the courtroom. Caldwell pounced on it. So you admit this isn't a real marriage. It's a legal fiction created to defraud my client. It's a real marriage built on respect instead of force, Caleb said. Maybe that's unfamiliar to you, Mr. Caldwell, but it's how I was raised to treat people. Morrison held up a hand. That's enough. Mr. Caldwell, do you have anything further? No, Your Honor. Mr. Rourke, you may step down. Caleb returned to his seat beside Lydia. Under the courtroom's watchful eyes, he took her hand openly, lacing their fingers together. Let them see. Let them judge. He didn't care anymore. Morrison surveyed the courtroom. Does Mr. Mercer wish to make a statement? Mercer stood, his expensive suit immaculate, his expression confident. Your Honor, I have only this to say. I am a businessman. I entered into a legal contract in good faith, expecting it to be honored. Mr. Rourke has interfered with that contract through deception and manipulation. I ask only that the law be upheld and that I receive what was promised to me. Mrs. Rourke was promised to you? Morrison asked. The contract clearly states, I didn't ask about the contract, Mr. Mercer. I asked if a human being was promised to you like a piece of property. Mercer's smile faltered. That's not how I would characterize it, Your Honor. Then how would you characterize it? As a marriage arrangement made between her father and myself, with the understanding that, with her knowledge, her father assured me that's not what I asked. Morrison's voice was sharp. Did Lydia Hale know about this arrangement before Mr. Rourke informed her? Mercer hesitated just a second too long. I was told she was aware. That's not an answer. No, Your Honor. I don't believe she was fully informed. Morrison leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. The courtroom held its breath. I've heard enough, he said finally. This court will recess for 1 hour while I consider my ruling. He stood and exited through the side door, leaving chaos in his wake. The hour passed like a lifetime. Lydia and Caleb stepped outside the courthouse into autumn sunshine that felt too bright, too cheerful for the weight they carried. People clustered in small groups on the street, discussing what they'd witnessed, placing bets on the outcome. Some looked at Lydia with pity, others with contempt, a few with something that might have been respect. Lydia didn't care about any of them. She walked to the end of the street where a small park offered a bench beneath a cottonwood tree, its leaves already turning gold. Caleb followed, positioning himself so he could see both the courthouse and anyone approaching. Even now, he was watchful. Even now, he was protecting her. They sat without speaking for a long time. Whatever he decides, Lydia finally said, I want you to know something. Caleb turned to look at her. You gave me something I never had before. Not safety, though you gave me that too. You gave me the belief that I was worth defending, that my choices mattered, that I was more than what men like my father and Mercer decided I was worth. Her voice was steady, but her eyes were bright. If Morrison rules against us, if Mercer's lawyers find a way to take me, I'll fight. I'll keep fighting, because you showed me I'm strong enough to. Caleb's hand found hers on the bench between them. You were always strong enough, Lydia. I just gave you room to remember it. Then we're even, she said, because you gave me room, and I gave you a reason to come back down from that mountain, to be part of the world again instead of hiding from it. Something shifted in Caleb's expression, vulnerability, recognition, gratitude. I wasn't hiding, he said quietly. I was waiting. I just didn't know what for. And now? Now I know. His thumb traced gentle circles on the back of her hand. I was waiting for someone worth fighting for. Someone who'd fight beside me instead of behind me. Someone who'd choose me not because they had to, but because they wanted to. Lydia's breath caught. Caleb, I know what I said in court, he interrupted gently, that I didn't know if it was love, but I lied, Lydia. I know exactly what it is. I've just been too afraid to say it because I didn't think I deserved it. Didn't think someone like you could choose someone like me if you had any other option. I've had other options, Lydia said. I could have run to the sheriff the first day and asked for protection. I could have gone to Reverend Hayes and begged him to help me disappear. I could have done 100 things that didn't involve marrying you. She turned to face him fully. But I chose you. Not because you were the safest choice, but because you were the right one. Because when you looked at me, you saw a person, not property. And because somewhere between that wedding and now, I stopped being afraid of you and started being afraid of losing you. Caleb's hand tightened on hers. If Morrison rules against us, then we run, Lydia said firmly. We take the horses and we ride into the high country where Mercer's lawyers can't reach us. We disappear into the mountains and we build a life where no one can touch us. That's not freedom, Caleb said. That's exile. Freedom isn't a place, Lydia replied. It's a choice. And I'm choosing you, whatever that means, wherever that takes us. Caleb looked at her for a long moment, and then he did something he'd never done before. He pulled her close and pressed his forehead to hers, his hand cradling the back of her head, his breath warm against her skin. Then we face it together, he whispered. Whatever comes. They stayed like that until Sheriff Brennan's voice called across the park. Court's back in session. The walk back to the courthouse felt like walking to a gallows. Lydia's hand stayed in Caleb's, their fingers interlaced, neither willing to let go. The crowd filed back inside, filling the seats, pressing against the walls, hungry for conclusion. Judge Morrison took his seat at the bench, his expression unreadable. He placed a single sheet of paper in front of him, adjusted his spectacles, and surveyed the courtroom. I've considered all testimony and evidence presented today, he began. This case raises fundamental questions about property rights, contractual obligations, and the nature of consent. It also raises questions about who has the right to determine a woman's future. Lydia's heart hammered against her ribs. Mr. Mercer's attorneys have presented a contract that is, on its face, legally binding under territorial law. Thomas Hale, as Lydia Hale's father, had legal authority to enter into agreements on her behalf until she reached majority or married. The contract is properly signed, witnessed, and notarized. Mercer's lawyers smiled. Across the aisle, Lydia felt Caleb's hand tighten on hers. However, Morrison continued, and the word cut through the courtroom like a blade, the law also recognizes certain fundamental rights that cannot be contracted away, even by legal guardians. Among these is the right to bodily autonomy and the right to choose one's spouse. Mercer's smile faltered. The contract before me does not propose a business arrangement or a property transfer. It proposes a marriage, and marriage, under both territorial and common law, requires the free consent of both parties, not the father's consent, not the groom's consent, both parties. Morrison looked directly at Lydia. Mrs. Rourke testified that she had no knowledge of this arrangement until after it had been made. Mr. Hale confirmed this in his own testimony. Mr. Mercer admitted he was uncertain whether she had been informed. Without her knowledge, there could be no consent. Without consent, there can be no valid marriage contract. Hope flared in Lydia's chest, bright and terrifying. Furthermore, Morrison said, the testimony I heard today convinces me that Mrs. Rourke's marriage to Mr. Rourke was entered into freely, with full knowledge of what she was choosing. Multiple witnesses confirmed that she understood the commitment she was making. Reverend Hayes, a man of impeccable reputation, testified that he counseled her beforehand and was satisfied she was acting of her own will. Morrison removed his spectacles and set them on the bench. The law exists to protect the vulnerable, not to enable their exploitation. If I were to rule in Mr. Mercer's favor, I would be declaring that a woman can be promised in marriage without her knowledge or consent, and that such a promise is more binding than her own freely chosen vows. I will not make that declaration. Lydia felt tears spill down her cheeks. Beside her, Caleb's shoulders shook with silent relief. Therefore, I rule that the contract between Thomas Hale and Grant Mercer is invalid due to lack of consent by the affected party. The marriage between Caleb Rourke and Lydia Hale Rourke is valid and legally binding. Mr. Mercer has no claim on Mrs. Rourke's person or her future. Morrison picked up his gavel. Furthermore, I am ordering that Mr. Mercer cease all contact with Mrs. Rourke and refrain from any action that could be construed as harassment or intimidation. Any violation of this order will result in charges of contempt and possible criminal prosecution. This court is adjourned. The gavel fell with a crack that echoed like thunder. For a moment, the courtroom was silent. Then chaos erupted. Mrs. Sullivan rushed forward, pulling Lydia into a fierce embrace. Reverend Hayes gripped Caleb's shoulder, his weathered face creased with joy. Sarah and Emma crowded close, both talking at once, their voices bright with relief. Even Sheriff Brennan allowed himself a small smile. Across the aisle, Mercer stood frozen, his face white with fury. His lawyers gathered their documents in tight-lipped silence. When Mercer's eyes found Lydia, she met his gaze steadily, without fear. She'd won. They'd won. Mercer turned and stalked out of the courtroom, his men following. The crowd parted for him, but this time it wasn't out of respect. It was out of the instinctive need to distance themselves from a man who'd just lost everything. Lydia turned to Caleb, and in front of everyone, in front of the whole town that had condemned their marriage, she threw her arms around his neck and held on tight. Caleb's arms came around her strong and sure, lifting her off her feet. He buried his face in her hair, and she felt him trembling. "We're free," she whispered against his shoulder. "We're really free." "You're free," Caleb corrected gently, setting her down but not releasing her. "The judge said the marriage is valid, but that doesn't mean you have to stay in it. You can file for annulment, get a legal separation." Lydia pulled back just far enough to look him in the eye. "Is that what you want?" "What I want doesn't matter. What matters is that you finally have the choice you should have had from the beginning." "Then I choose you," Lydia said clearly, loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. "Not because I have to, not because I'm afraid, because I want to, because somewhere between that mountain cabin and this courtroom, I fell in love with the man who gave me my life back." Caleb's eyes went wide. "Lydia, I love you," she said again, the words coming easier the second time. "I love your strength and your gentleness and the way you've never once tried to own me. I love that you gave me space when I needed it and stood beside me when I needed that more. I love that you see me as a person worth fighting for, and I want to spend the rest of my life proving that you were right to believe in me." For a long moment, Caleb just stared at her. Then he cupped her face in his scarred, gentle hands and kissed her. It was their first kiss, real and chosen and witnessed by a courtroom full of people. And it was perfect. When they finally broke apart, the small crowd around them was smiling. Even Mrs. Pruitt, standing near the back, had the grace to look embarrassed. Reverend Hayes cleared his throat. "I believe congratulations are in order, though I suppose I already said those weeks ago." Lydia laughed, the sound bright and free. "Say them again, Reverend. This time they mean something different." "Then congratulations," Hayes said warmly. "To both of you. On your marriage, your courage, and your victory." They spent the rest of the afternoon accepting congratulations from people who doubted them, ignored them, or condemned them. Some were sincere. Others were hedging their bets, wanting to be on the right side of history. Lydia accepted them all with grace, but she no longer needed their approval. She had something better. She had the truth. As evening approached, they returned to the boarding house to gather their belongings. Mrs. Sullivan insisted on packing them food for the journey back to the mountain cabin, refusing to accept payment. "You gave this town something it needed," she said firmly, wrapping fresh bread in cloth. "You showed us that courage isn't about being fearless. It's about being afraid and doing what's right anyway. Take the food. It's the least I can do." Lydia hugged her. "Thank you for everything." "You come back and visit," Mrs. Sullivan ordered. "Don't become strangers just because you live in the high country." "We won't," Lydia promised. They walked to the stable where their horses waited. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. Caleb saddled both animals while Lydia secured their packs, their movements synchronized from weeks of working together. Before they could mount, a figure emerged from the shadows between buildings. Thomas Hale. Lydia's hand stilled on the saddle. Caleb moved closer to her, protective but not interfering. Her father approached slowly, hat in hand, his face haggard. "Lydia, could I have a word?" Every instinct told Lydia to refuse, to turn away, to deny him the absolution he was seeking. But she found she couldn't. Anger was exhausting, and she was tired of carrying it. "Say what you need to say," she told him. Thomas swallowed hard. "I know I got no right to ask for forgiveness. I know what I did was unforgivable. I sold my own daughter to save myself, and then I was too much of a coward to even tell you what I'd done." His voice cracked. "Your mother would be ashamed of me. I'm ashamed of me." "You should be," Lydia said quietly. "I am. Every day." Thomas looked at Caleb. "I want to thank you for doing what I should have done, for protecting her when I failed to." Caleb's expression was hard. "I didn't do it for you." I know, but I'm grateful anyway. Thomas turned back to Lydia. I'm selling the ranch. What's left of it. I'm leaving Montana Territory, going east to live with my brother. I can't stay here, can't face what I've become. That's probably for the best, Lydia said. Before I go, I wanted to tell you something. Your mother made me promise before she died that I'd always protect you, that I'd make sure you had choices, that you'd be free to become whoever you wanted to be. His eyes were wet. I broke that promise, but you kept it yourself. You became exactly who she hoped you'd be, strong, brave, and free. And I'm proud of you, Lydia, even though I got no right to be. Lydia felt her own tears threaten. Goodbye, Father. It was dismissal and farewell all at once. Thomas nodded, replaced his hat, and walked away into the gathering dark. Lydia watched until he disappeared, feeling a chapter of her life close with finality. Caleb's hand found her shoulder. You all right? I am, Lydia said, and realized she meant it. He made his choices. I've made mine. And mine are better. They mounted their horses and rode out of Red Hollow as the first stars appeared overhead. The town grew smaller behind them, fading into memory. Ahead, the mountains rose dark against the sky, promising sanctuary and home. They rode in comfortable silence until they reached the fork where the main trail split. One path led back to the cabin. The other continued west, toward new territories, new possibilities. Caleb reined in his horse. Which way? Lydia understood the question beneath the question. They could go back to the cabin, to the life they'd built in isolation, or they could ride toward something new, build something different. The cabin, she said without hesitation. It's home. Our home. Caleb smiled, and in the starlight, his face looked years younger. Our home, he agreed. They reached the cabin well after midnight, exhausted but exhilarated. The structure stood exactly as they'd left it, solid and waiting. Smoke rose from the chimney. Caleb had banked the fire before they'd left, and it had smoldered faithfully, ready to burst into life again. Like them. Caleb tended the horses while Lydia rekindled the fire, adding logs until warmth filled the small space. When Caleb came inside, he barred the door not against threats but out of habit, securing their sanctuary. They stood in the firelight, suddenly uncertain. Everything had changed. The marriage that had been legal fiction was now acknowledged truth. The partnership built on necessity had transformed into something chosen and real. Lydia, Caleb began. She crossed to him and took his hands. I meant what I said in town, every word. So did I, Caleb said. But I want you to understand something. I'm not good at pretty words. I don't know how to be romantic or charming. I'm a man who's better with silence than conversation, better with actions than promises. I don't want pretty words, Lydia said. I want the truth. Then here's the truth. Caleb's hands tightened on hers. I was dead before you came into my life. I was breathing, but I wasn't living. I'd given up on believing I deserved happiness or connection or love. And then you walked into that chapel, terrified but brave, and you trusted me with your life. And suddenly I had a reason to be better than I was. He lifted one hand to cup her face. You made me want to come down from this mountain. You made me want to be part of the world again. You made me believe I could be more than my scars and my mistakes. And I love you for that. I love you for your courage and your strength and the way you stood in that courtroom and claimed your own life. Lydia's vision blurred with tears. I love you too, for seeing me when everyone else looked through me, for giving me choices when everyone else tried to take them away, for being exactly who you are, without apology or pretense. They came together like two people who'd been walking toward each other for a lifetime, finally closing the distance. Caleb's kiss was gentle at first, tentative, asking permission even now. Lydia answered by pulling him closer, threading her fingers through his hair, showing him without words that she wanted this, wanted him, chose this freely. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Caleb rested his forehead against hers. The loft or the bed? He asked quietly. Your choice. Always your choice. Lydia smiled. The bed. Together. If that's what you want too. It's all I want, Caleb said. They made love slowly, carefully, learning each other with the reverence of people who understood the gift of freely given intimacy. Caleb was gentle, attentive, patient, treating Lydia like she was something precious rather than something owned. And Lydia discovered that true strength wasn't about domination, but about vulnerability, about trusting someone enough to let them see you completely. Afterward, they lay tangled together beneath the quilts Lydia had mended, listening to the wind in the pines and the creek's constant murmur. Caleb traced lazy patterns on Lydia's shoulder, his touch feather light. "What are you thinking?" Lydia asked. "That I'm the luckiest man in the Montana Territory," Caleb said. "That I don't deserve you, but I'm going to spend the rest of my life trying to." "You already deserve me," Lydia said, "because you gave me the one thing no one else would. You gave me myself back." She felt him smile against her hair. "Then we're even, because you did the same for me." They fell asleep like that. Two people who'd been forged in fear and desperation into something stronger than either had been alone. Two people who'd chosen each other not because they had to, but because in a world that tried to make them both into victims, they'd decided to become partners instead. The weeks that followed were the happiest of Lydia's life. They settled into the rhythms of the mountain cabin with new understanding, no longer strangers sharing space, but partners building a life. Caleb taught Lydia to track game through the forest, to read weather in the clouds, to survive in the high country. Lydia taught Caleb to let his guard down, to laugh, to believe he was worthy of the happiness he'd found. They made plans. In the spring, they'd expand the cabin, add a second room for the children they both wanted. They'd plan a larger garden, maybe raise chickens. Caleb talked about taking Lydia to see the hot springs in the high valleys, places of wild beauty he'd kept to himself for years. Lydia talked about teaching reading and writing to children in the scattered homesteads below, sharing the education her mother had given her. Word filtered up from Red Hollow through occasional visitors. Mercer had left the territory, his business empire crumbling after the trial exposed his methods. Thomas Hale had indeed gone east, and no one expected to see him again. The town had moved on to other scandals, other stories. But the legend of the mountain man's bride persisted. People told it wrong, of course. They said Lydia had been forced to marry the most dangerous man in the territory. They said she'd been stolen away to a mountain prison. They said it was a story of violence and captivity. They never understood the truth. One evening in late November, as the first serious snow began to fall, Lydia and Caleb sat by the fire. Lydia was mending one of Caleb's shirts. The shoulder seam had torn during a day of splitting wood. Caleb was whittling, creating what she now recognized as small wooden animals for the children they'd one day have. "Do you ever regret it?" Caleb asked suddenly. "Marrying me instead of taking your chances with the law, with running away, with any of the other options you might have had?" Lydia set down her mending and looked at her husband, because that's what he truly was now, in every sense that mattered. She studied his scarred face, his careful hands, the eyes that had learned to trust again because she'd proven herself worthy of that trust. "Never," she said. "Not for a single moment. Even though it was hard, even though you were afraid." "Especially because of that," Lydia said. "The easy choice would have been to let fear win, to let men like Mercer and my father decide my worth and my future. But I didn't. We didn't. We chose the hard thing, the brave thing, the right thing." She moved to sit beside him, curling into his warmth. "You gave me a choice when no one else would," she continued. "And I chose you. I chose this life. I chose this mountain, this cabin, this partnership. And I'd make the same choice every day for the rest of my life, because it's mine. We're mine. And that's worth everything." Caleb set down his whittling and pulled her close. Outside, the snow fell steadily, blanketing the world in white. Inside, the fire crackled warm and bright. "I love you," Caleb said quietly. "Not because you needed saving, not because I needed redemption, but because you're the other half of me I didn't know I was missing." "I love you too," Lydia replied. "My mountain man, my partner, my choice." She kissed him then, slow and deep, tasting pine smoke and coffee and home. When they finally pulled apart, both smiling, Caleb stood and offered her his hand. "Dance with me," he said. "There's no music. We don't need music." So they danced in the firelight, swaying to a rhythm only they could hear, Two people who'd found each other in the darkest circumstances and chosen to build something bright. Two people who'd been told they were broken beyond repair and had instead become each other's healing. The town would keep telling the story wrong for years to come. They'd say she was forced to marry the most dangerous man alive, that she had no choice, that it was a tragedy disguised as a wedding. But Lydia knew better. The truth was simpler and far braver than any legend. He'd given her a choice when everyone else tried to take it away. He'd offered her safety without demanding ownership. He'd shown her what partnership could be when built on respect instead of possession, and she'd chosen him. Not because she was forced, not because she was desperate, not because she had no other options, but because in a world that tried to make her powerless, Caleb Rourke had given her the greatest power of all, the power to choose her own future, and she'd chosen love. Outside, the snow fell soft and steady over the Montana mountains, covering the world in quiet beauty. And inside the cabin, two people who'd been strangers just months before held each other close, building a future one choice at a time, a future that belonged to them, a future they'd fought for, earned, and claimed, a future built on the simple revolutionary truth that the best marriages aren't the ones society approves of, but the ones two people choose freely, bravely, and without regret. This was their story, their truth, their choice. And it was only the beginning.